Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope I live up to the billing. And let me say first what a great honour it is to be invited to speak at a Sinn Féin rally, and the first of, I hope, many United Ireland rallies. Let's maybe hope there's 32 of them, and I hope I'm there for a lot of them. And secondly, I'd like to offer my congratulations to people, most of whom are in this room, and that's to the electorate of Donegal South West. And not just the 40% of them that made Pierce Doherty their first preference vote, but as someone who's quite nerdy about numbers, I looked at the transfer votes. And one of the things that was clear in the transfer votes was that every stage, every dropout of each candidate, in every successive round, Pierce got a greater proportion of the second preference vote at every stage. And that's a truly remarkable achievement, and congratulations to him and all those that worked on the campaign. Now, it's an odd thing at a time like this for the Economist to be left to last, because you'd say it's very hard to build a story that would make people leave the room with any joy in their heart or any hope for the future or any expectation that things can be better. So I want to deal very briefly with some of the bad things, because you'll know them and you experience them day to day more than I do. But on the bailout, I just wanted to say a couple of things. The bailout, it should be clear who's being bailed out. And one of the aspects of this very strange triumvirate or troika that people talk about, the IMF, the EU and the ECB, is that they insist that Ireland bailed itself out, because they are providing 85 billion euros, but 17.5 billion euros comes directly out of assets already held in Ireland. Those at the National Pension Reserve Fund at the Central Bank. And that, I think, should be a clue as to who's being bailed out. You can't bail yourself out. You're bailing someone else out. And the 85 billion is simply a lien on the future incomes of the people of this state. All the money is coming from the people of this state, and all of it is going to bankers. Living in Britain, I have to observe a debate which begins with the Chancellor in Britain, George Osborne, saying that he's offering £7 billion. British find it very difficult to talk in euros. He's offering £7 billion to help a friend in need. And by that, he apparently means Ireland. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The friend in need he's bailing out and he's helping are British banks. The biggest single holder of Irish government debt is the publicly owned Royal Bank of Scotland. And altogether, British banks have loans and bonds outstanding to people, to government and to corporate entities in this state equivalent to $220 billion. Now, that's the reason that George Osborne is participating in that. But not just George Osborne, that's the reason that the governments of Europe are doing this. It's the taxpayers of Ireland who will be forced and obliged to pay off debts that are owed by the Irish banks to those banks in Europe. And as a result, there's only one answer. There's only one answer. When you're faced with a situation where we talk about 85 billion, it's actually 100 billion if you include the assets taken from the central bank and the pension reserve fund. That's 100 billion for a population of less than 5 million. That's 20,000 euros for every child, woman and man in this state. And on top of that, there'll be an austerity package, so-called, of 15 billion euros. Again, that's more than 3,000 euros for every child, woman and man in this state. And it's clear that those debts need to be repudiated before anything can be accomplished, because those debts weren't incurred by the taxpayers of Ireland. Now, how did we get here? Because we're here to mark, not celebrate, an anniversary. And one of the very first things that the new what became the Free State subsequently, but the new government did after partition, one of the first things it did was to buy British government debt. So times haven't changed very much, it's just the form of the enslavement has changed. The reason that they bought as British government debt was so that the currency here would not deviate from sterling, and that was done in order to support the very largest farmers of the state, whose sole export was live cattle to Britain. And of course, times having changed, the people that they now support are not any longer large farmers, they're property speculators and bankers. So it's only the forms that have changed, and it's only some of the addresses, but nothing fundamentally has changed. But that's the negative bit. I want to talk about what can be done positively, because the reality is there's an enormous amount of wealth in this state. When Newt Gingrich said of the US-led invasion of Iraq, we wouldn't go there if all they were growing is carrots, we're going there for the oil. The reason that the EU, the IMF and the ECB are in town is because there's lots of wealth. If there was no wealth, they wouldn't bother. They'd let Ireland go hang the way they let lots of African countries go hang. So there's lots of wealth created in this society. The question is, who controls it, who owns it, and what's it used for? Now I want to talk about only just one brief aspect of that, which relates to the economies, bizarrely enough, both sides of this border, i.e. what should be one economy, and that's the issue of health. Because one of the Jerry talked about the genuine concerns and fears of unionists, but actually in some cases not just unionists. One of the issues that does concern people in the north, and Jerry and others will know this better than me, is the existence of the National Health Service. That's one of the things that people cling to as a reason not to have a united Ireland. And it's also argued that the North alone couldn't fund an NHS, and that combined with the South it wouldn't be able to do so either. And those are a series of myths that have been built up over a prolonged period in order to justify, one of the ways is to justify partition. Firstly, dealing with the North, that there's insufficient funds and the North only, in effect, exists by subsidy from Britain. But it's vastly overstated, vastly overstated. The reality is, when you hear unionists and the British government talk about that, all they talk about is the funds from central government in Whitehall to the North. But those are the type of funds that happen in any state. And what they neglect is the flow of taxes from the North to the central exchequer in Whitehall. And the gap between the two is not massive. The most recent data that I've seen, because it's very hard, the British government is often very secretive about these things, the most recent data I've seen is that the gap between the two is only £3 billion. It's not an enormous sum, it's not the 14 that they routinely talk of. But more importantly than that, is that there's huge wealth also created in the North. At the last count, £29 billion in sterling. And what was received in terms of wages and salaries by people in the North was only £16 billion. And they're the people that created that 29. There's a 13 billion gap. And that flows overwhelmingly as profits out of the 6 counties, often to British firms, but also to other foreign multinationals. I.e., there's huge wealth in the North that it doesn't remain in the hands of the people of the North to fund things like the health service. But when we come to this side of the border, things become even more ridiculous as regards the health service. Because it's often argued, frequently argued, by the government and its supporters here, that we're too poor here to have a health service. This is at the same time, you should be aware, that the government here has for a long time, up until the recent crisis, been well known in European circles for boasting that it had the highest per capita GDP of any country in the EU. So they tell the population of this state one thing, that they're too poor to have a health service, and annoy their European counterparts by telling them how wealthy they are compared to everyone else. The reality is, even after the first 2 years of the crisis here, 2008-2009, per capita GDP in this state was still slightly above that of France. And France has the most excellent health service in the whole of Western Europe. There's a reason for that. It's because they spend money on it. They spend about 50% more per head on healthcare than is spent in this state, and virtually all of that is by the government. They have an excellent health service because they spend money on it. Now, typically, of course, we talk about France as just that. France is the proper name for the country is the Republic of France. And in fact, so keen have they been to establish a proper republic that they're on their 5th one. And they're probably still not satisfied with it yet. And what that tells you is that people have a desire for a true republican ideal, which is equality. Equality of outcomes in terms of things like health, which is vastly missing both sides of the border. And for obvious reasons, the North doesn't operate under the jurisdiction of the Republic. The inequality of outcomes is startling. Your life expectancy at birth, if you live in the richest borough of London, Kensington and Chelsea, is 84.5 years. It's 11 years lower if you live in Belfast. That's not equal. Similarly, in this state, the outcomes in terms of expected longevity are entirely a function of your wealth, not of your need, not of your requirements, but of your wealth. That's an anti-republican idea. Now, to give you very briefly an outline of what I think the future is, where it holds, is what people have talked about here and elsewhere is export-led recoveries. We should export more to places like India and China. Don't disagree with that. We're all in favour of exporting more, also in favour of importing more, because importing is also a very efficient way of organising economic activity. But I think we can do better than that, simply than increase exports and also increase imports. I think we can learn from countries like India and China. And there's a lot in common that this state and this people have in common with those people, the Indians and the Chinese. They suffered for centuries under foreign rule and occupation. They suffered the worst of colonialism. Hundreds of millions of people across those two countries, collectively, in aggregate, died under colonialism. They suffered national humiliation under British rule in particular. There are lots of parallels. One of the things they did in different degrees is they ended that national humiliation by taking control of their own destinies. And as a result, they now have the strongest growth rates in the world. That's why everyone's saying we must export to them, we must trade with them. And one of the ways they did that, most especially in China, when foreign capital wouldn't come willy-nilly, and foreign capital was used in part to dismember the country previously, is they used the government intervention in the economy in order to grow the economy, and that's when the foreign capital came, because they knew they could make money. So what I wanted to leave you with is the idea that yes, this is a disaster, but it's a disaster of someone else's making, and people like you, people in this room can end that, can change that, by having a republic in which the struggle for equality, of outcomes in things like health and education, is directed through the government, through a republican government, which in this island would be both sides of the border. A government which uses the full levers of the state in order to benefit the economy, benefit the people in it, and then you watch the foreign investors come. Then they come not to put you in a vice, but then they come falling over themselves to give you money to invest so they can make money and this economy can grow.